And if a country wants to have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, why not?
Callousness that I'm shocked at, because in Europe, especially in Germany and in Austria, you cannot talk about denying the Holocaust. Otherwise, it's a violation of the German law and the Austrian law. Freedom of speech does not exist in a vacuum. If you want to violate the One China policy, you'll be barred from China. You will suffer all the consequences.
Well, let's bring in our guests. From Brussels, we're joined by Carol Lano, CEO of the Centre for European Policy Studies. From Beijing, we're joined by Victor Gao, Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalization. And from Rome, we're joined by Raffaella Marchetti, Director of the Centre for International and Strategic Studies at Luis University. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. Let's start with you, Carol. Where are China-EU relations right now? Sure, they have their differences politically. There's perhaps a deep-seated mistrust between them, but to what extent, at this moment, are they economically codependent?
They are very interdependent, both of them. But as you were just saying in introduction, China has a big surplus with Europe, above all a goods surplus. And Europe needs these goods, let's say, for its economy. But you could say the dependence is also on the Chinese side because China is losing the US market. So for them to keep the European market is extremely important. So China will need to work to improve the access to its market for European goods. Otherwise, let's say, it risks, let's say, to be losing out on the European side as well. I mean, our current Commission president under her first mandate has called China a systemic rival. Because of the current tensions which we have in the United States and this enormous deadline of the 9th of July for, let's say, coming to a tariff agreement with the US, this sentence already, this talk about China has been a bit softened, but it remains so, let's say, that China is a competitor with the EU on many fields, which we see, as you were saying, also clearly in the domain of cars, which was traditionally one of the areas where Europe was strong, which is now risks to be overtaken by electric cars from China. And that's why the EU last year decided, let's say, to have tariffs on different brands of Chinese electric cars in different degrees, just because they were seen as a threat to the European market.
Victor Gao, in Beijing, you heard Carol there saying that China needs to improve access to its markets for EU goods. How does China view its relationship with the EU at the moment? What does it want from it? And what is it prepared to do to get that?
Thank you very much for having me. From the Chinese perspective, EU is a very important trading partner, and the relations between China and EU are not of rivalry or competition. We just need to get along with each other, respecting each other's differences, and try to overcome these differences by cooperation. Now, you mentioned the EU's access to the China market. China welcomes many things produced and exported by EU, but they need to be competitive. Otherwise, they'll be priced out of the market. From the Chinese perspective, we are the champion and the standard bearer of EV car. But the real competition involving EV car is not between EU or China. It's between the fuel car technology, which is a technology of the past, versus EV car technology, which is a technology of the tomorrow. So, from the philosophical point of view, European countries need to make that leap of faith to embrace EV car revolution, because otherwise their fuel car revolution will become obsolete. And one of the main engines of economic development for EU will be knocked down, not by China, but by the technological transformation. I will be happy to do whatever we can to improve European access to the China market, which will be the largest market in the world. And I'm shocked to hear President Trump said China is bad and EU even worse. Let me tell you, China is not bad. EU is not worse. It is time for China and EU to see each other in the real light and respect each other and try to do our best to improve China-EU cooperation.
Raffaella, what did you make of what Victor was saying there? We talked earlier about this huge trade gap between the two. Who needs who more right now, the EU or China?
Well, from the EU side, China is an important partner. Is an important partner for access to the Chinese market. Is an important partner for certain technologies and certain materials like rare earths and minerals that are important for the EU industries. However, of course, there are also problems. I mean, it's decades at least that the EU complains about the access to the Chinese market, that the level playing field is not entirely accessible to the European capital, for instance. I mean, entering the financial market in China is complex. So there are a number of issues beyond the issues of security, which is another chapter, but trade is complex, but is needed. If we take the view of the European business, there is a clear recognition that the partnership with China is a strategic asset for the future. If you only look at, for instance, the largest economy in Europe, that is the German economy, the German economy relied heavily on the export to the Chinese market. And that was a very strong component of the German growth in the last at least 2 decades. So this remains an important channel for the development of European economy. Of course, this needs to be understood within the context, the largest context. Here, the elephant in the room is the US, is all the troubles, all the difficulties of struggles to reach an agreement about trade deal with the Trump administration. And for some obvious reasons, China and the EU are now pushed to a rapprochement, also because of the struggle with the US.
Carol, feel free to come in on anything that you've heard, but let's talk about the elephant in the room. To what extent is the trilateral dynamic between the EU, China, and the US right now akin to a troubled marriage, if you like? I mean, who's in the driving seat, and how much is the US interfering in the relationship or the development of any productive economic relationship between the EU and China?
It's difficult to say how is in the driving seat at the moment between the EU and China. I think overall, the world as a whole, we simply have to look at the newspapers. We see that the United States is in the driving seat. But between the EU and China, difficult to say, because the EU will say, look, there is no level playing field between the EU and China. And there's so many things which are ongoing in China which we don't know. Just take one thing to start with. I mean, the overall budget situation of the China's state. I mean, we don't have any data. There's a lot of debts or eventually bad debts with state-owned enterprises of which we don't have any information. There's a lot of subsidies to these state-owned enterprises of which we don't have any information. And we know also that the WTO, which China joined in 2001, is not functioning as it should. So basically, there is no level playing field. If we want to export capital from China, there is a problem because there is no full convertibility of the renminbi. I mean, you want to say, look, we have made a lot of profits over there, but you cannot formally really consolidate it and your profits because the money is stuck somewhere in China. If a bank wants to do business in China, it's forced to put its servers on Chinese servers. It cannot keep its data for itself. So there are plenty of things, let's say, where the access to the Chinese market is not like what the Chinese have in Europe. And that's what we need to work on. Of course, we know that the Chinese economy is extremely competitive, extremely strong. But it's like with the US for Europe. We are mutually interdependent. But if you have a mutual interdependence, that means it's a give and take relationship, both sides.
Victor, what did you make of that? Caught between Washington and Beijing in this growing trade war, you might think that the EU would have compelling reasons to seek ever closer ties, economic ties with China. Why do you think it hasn't done so? And why has China offered so very little in terms of incentives for the EU to do that? Is China somehow sensing weakness here and playing a waiting game?
Well, first of all, the U.S. Maximum global tariff war is not only against China, it's against the EU and against all the rest of the world. I would say that the U.S. tariff war is an unjustified war. It's the wrong war. It's damaging, if not undermining, free trade. China steps up to defend not only its own economic interest, but in reality to defend free trade. And for China to defend free trade, it's for the benefit of EU, for all the European countries, and ironically, for the fundamental interest of the American people. So I think the EU has a choice. Now, either you're caving to the maximum pressure from the United States, or you really fight to protect and defend the free trade, like China is doing. From that perspective, I think China and EU should really see the real matters of the world today in the same light. That is, we should promote free trade. We should do whatever we can to promote free trade. Now, while I fully respect the previous panelists, allow me to mention several things. It really takes two to tango. Between China and EU, let's do our best to sign up this comprehensive agreement of investment, because China is in a position to provide lots of capital to European countries for their continued development. China can have, the market size to accommodate many products from Europe, but it's up to the European countries to really do their homework, to really figure out what are the products that the Chinese market want to accept. Because, as I mentioned, some of the products are way out of the marketability in China. Some of the products are not up to standards by Chinese standards. And some of the products are basically being phased out, like fuel cars, which enjoy the brisk market in China for decades. So I think China and the EU should really talk with each other. But of primary responsibility is to sign up this CAI agreement as quickly as possible.
Okay. Rafaela, what do you make of that? You mentioned the word security. What does the EU need in terms of security? Is China willing to provide that, do you think? And is the EU going to be forced to take sides in this trade war between the US and China? Or can it continue to somehow fudge it and tread some sort of strategic middle line?
Well, the security chapter is way more complex. Of course, in security matters, the alignment between the EU and the US, I would say, is total. So it's very difficult for the EU, for any country, to think about doing some security deal with China or even selling, for instance, weapons to China. There are two specific issues that needs to be discussed. On the one hand, there is a traditional issues about cybersecurity and industrial espionage and other kinds of issues that have been traditionally issues raised of concern from the European Union, raised in many different meetings with Chinese officials. The other issue, of course, is reassuring measures that needs to be provided by Europeans in the so-called Indo-Pacific. Increasingly, European countries are present into the Indo-Pacific, developing and strengthening partnership with Indo-Pacific countries, participating to exercise, developing joint military industrial projects. So clearly, this is perceived by China as something uncomfortable. And here, I think the EU needs to make an effort to send reassuring messages because, of course, these can generate some harsh feeling and escalation between the two.
Carol, with its huge economic clout, why does the EU seem unable to take a harder line with China over issues that Rafaela was just talking about there? Human rights, what's going on in the Pacific, and the one that particularly upsets the EU, of course, China's support for Russia over the war in Ukraine.
I think the EU has taken a harder line. Even before the war in Ukraine started in 2021, there was a case between China and Lithuania on coercion by China, which didn't accept goods from Lithuania anymore because Lithuania had taken a positive stance on Taiwan, and the EU defended its country, Lithuania, very rapidly, very strongly, adopted anti-coercion legislation and brought a case before the WTO. Also, China in that period had blacklisted a group of think tankers, people like me, but also members of the European Parliament, of being too critical on China, and they were forbidden to ever enter China anymore. Of course, it appears that China has now repealed this. So there have been frictions from the Chinese side towards Europe, and it's not that the EU has not taken a common stance. Also, I just referred to this case about electric cars that we have we have examined this case, and we have clearly said that there was a case of subsidies. Hence, we have taken these tariffs, let's say, for several cars, let's say, coming from China to protect the European market. For the reasons which, again, I explained, let's say, it was unclear how the companies were financing themselves and whether there was any state aid by the Chinese state, let's say, to have this huge presence in the electric vehicles market for the Chinese state.
Victor, if the EU is such an important trading partner for China, why does China continue to hold such close ties with Russia, knowing that it upsets the EU greatly? Economically, at least, the EU is far more valuable a partner for China than Russia. What is China's thinking here?
Before I talk about China-Russian relations, let me respond to what your previous panelist mentioned. He mentioned Lithuania. For the record, allow me to emphasize, what the Lithuanian government wanted to do is in violation of the One China policy, which is the foundation upon which China-Lithuanian diplomatic relations were established. And as a matter of principle, China will never allow any country, big or small, to violate the One China policy. Therefore, the problem is in Lithuania's court, and EU should not support this violation of the One China policy, because otherwise you completely foul up China-EU relations.
Okay.
Now, for talking about China,
hang on a second. We'll come to Russia. Victor, we'll come to China, Russia in a moment, but let's throw it back to Carol just a minute, because I know he wants to take issue with that.
No, we have a freedom of press. Of course, a country is free to say what they want about Taiwan. Let's say, I mean, of course, we have there may be a one China policy, but we know that China has, Taiwan has its position. And if a country wants to have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, why not in its way? This is not a problem.
Okay, Victor, carry on, please.
The lack of sensitivity and the level of callousness that I'm shocked at. Because in Europe, especially in Germany and in Austria, you cannot talk about denying the Holocaust. Otherwise, it's a violation of the German law and the Austrian law. Freedom of speech does not exist in a vacuum. If you want to violate the One China policy, you'll be barred from China. You will suffer all the consequences. Lithuania or any other country. Therefore, politicians and think tank people should really know the sensitivity. If you want to foul up with the One China policy, you are deserving to be punished because you violate the One China policy. Period.
Victor, let's not get too bogged down in this. The issue with Russia, you were going to talk to us about that.
Let me talk about Russia. Yeah, China and Russia share a common border of 4,300 kilometers. For decades, it is a border of peace. We respect each other. We trust each other. The long border is not armed. Now, some Europeans talk about Chinese support of Russia. Let me tell you, and this is a reformation of what the Chinese government has said, if China provides military support to Russia, the war with Ukraine will be over overnight. You really believe China has provided military support to Russia? Zero. Let me put it on the record. China does not support Russia. China does not support Ukraine. From day one, China has been calling on Russia and Ukraine to stop the war as quickly as possible. Why? Because China is concerned that that war has the risks of getting out of control, escalating from a conventional war to a nuclear war. We need to do all we can to put the war to an end right away, rather than allowing that to escalate.
Very okay. Rafaela, is there doubt within the EU Commission over just how tough its stance on Beijing should be? EU leaders conspicuously avoided mentioning China in their summit conclusions recently, despite effort from some countries to call out Beijing's continued military support for Russia. Why was that?
Well, of course, there is some degree, a certain degree of variance into among the EU member states. Some are more prone and open to cooperate with China. Others are less. Others are changing position. I mean, traditionally, Germany, for instance, had a very friendly, quite open relation with China. With the current administration in Germany, the tone is way tougher. So, I mean, on the one hand, there is a common policy, and the negotiation, the meeting itself will be run on behalf of the European Union as such. But of course, there are different sensitivities in different countries. We know this, not only in relation to the alleged support or not support to Russia, but in general to the relationship with China. That depends also on the relation that the country has with the US. So it's a complex network of interactions. But at the end of the day, I mean, the meeting that will take place in a few weeks' time will be an EU-China meeting. So there will be joint positions presented by EU representatives. And this is important from the European perspective.
Is it, Rafaela, going to be anything other than a talking shop? Will anything concrete come out of that?
No, I do think that this is the moment for restarting some important dialogues. We know, I mean, the world is in a very deep transition. And clearly, European Union and China, being two major world powers, need to resettle some issues and pave the way for cooperation. Of course, this doesn't mean that there won't be any problems and troubles and controversies. I mean, they will be there. But at the same time, it's absolutely important that Europe and China are able to find a common ground, meaning if each of the counterparts needs to give up on certain issues, this is part of the negotiation, and reaching a common point. This is difficult, but it's absolutely necessary.
Carol, we've got about a minute left. Can Europe ever be a continent on its own terms without being this third wheel, if you like, to China and the US? You know, without needing the US for security guarantees, without needing trade with China?
No, but there is no continent which is on its own. If you look at the overall trade balances between the US, China, and Europe, let's say we are extremely independent. The three of us, certainly the EU and the US in the first place, because there's a lot of investments both sides. But for goods trade, for example, where there is a huge surplus from China, I mean, there is an enormous market, and China needs that market, as we just heard. So, as Roberto just said, let's say we need to have come to a solution which, I mean, serve both interests. But of course, there are some difficult decisions to be taken to do that.
There, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to edit. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Carol Lano, Victor Gao, and Rafaela Marchetti.